In the autumn of 1356, on a muddy field outside the French city of Poitiers, the unthinkable happened. A French king, anointed by God himself, knelt in the dirt and surrendered his royal glove to an English knight. This wasn't just another medieval skirmish. This was the moment that shattered French pride, emptied their treasury for decades, and turned a 26-year-old English prince into a legend whose name would echo through the centuries. The Black Prince had done what seemed impossible. With just 6,000 men, he had humiliated the flower of French chivalry, captured their sovereign, and walked away with the greatest ransom in medieval history. But how did it happen? How did Edward of Woodstock, eldest son of Edward III, manage to orchestrate one of the most stunning military victories of the Middle Ages against seemingly impossible odds? This is the story of cunning strategy, devastating tactics, and the brutal reality of medieval warfare. By the time we're finished, you'll understand exactly how the Battle of Poitiers became the catastrophe that brought France to its knees and made England the dominant power in Western Europe. Because what happened on that September day wasn't just a battle. It was a masterclass in military genius that changed the course of history forever. The stage was already set for disaster long before the Black Prince ever set foot on French soil. By 1356, France was a kingdom tearing itself apart from within. The Black Death had swept through the land like the wrath of God, killing between a third and half of the population. Villages lay abandoned, fields went untilled, and the very fabric of French society was unraveling at the seams. King John II, who had inherited this nightmare, was described by his own subjects as severely hated throughout his realm. The chroniclers of the time painted a picture of a monarch whose authority was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. In Arras, rebels rose up and murdered royal loyalists in the streets. The great nobles of Normandy, those proud lords who should have been the backbone of the kingdom, refused outright to pay their taxes to the crown. But John's troubles ran deeper than mere rebellion. The kingdom was plagued by roving bands of mercenaries known as the Grands Compagnies, lawless soldiers who pillaged the countryside at will. These routiers, as they were called, operated with virtual impunity, turning once prosperous regions into wastelands of burned villages and terrorized peasants. Popular uprisings known as jacqueries erupted across the land as desperate farmers and townspeople lashed out against a feudal system that could no longer protect them. The French royal administration, according to modern historian Jonathan Sumption, had fallen apart in jealous acrimony and recrimination. The king's own nobles schemed against each other while their realm burned around them. It was into this chaos that John made one of his most catastrophic decisions. On April 5th, 1356, he arrested Charles II, King of Navarre, along with 9 of his most outspoken critics. 4 of these men were summarily executed, their heads rolling in what was meant to be a display of royal authority. Instead, it was the spark that lit the fuse. The Norman nobles who had escaped arrest turned in desperation to Edward III of England, begging for his intervention. They had just handed the English king the perfect pretext for invasion, and Edward was not a man to waste such opportunities. This was the moment when the Black Prince entered the stage. Edward of Woodstock, heir to the English throne, had already earned his spurs at the Battle of Crécy a decade earlier. But now, at 26, he was about to embark on the campaign that would define his legacy and earn him a place among the greatest military commanders in history. The strategy he would employ was called a chevauchée, a French word that meant promenade or horse charge, depending on the context. But this innocent-sounding term masked one of the most brutal and effective forms of medieval warfare ever devised. A chevauchée was not just a raid, it was systematic economic destruction, designed to cripple an enemy's ability to wage war by destroying the very foundations of their power. The concept was devastatingly simple. A fast-moving force of mounted soldiers would sweep through enemy territory like a plague of locusts, burning crops, destroying mills, slaughtering livestock, and reducing thriving communities to smoking ruins. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. When peasants saw their fields burning and their lord powerless to protect them, the bonds of feudal loyalty began to snap like overstretched rope. This was not random pillaging by undisciplined brigands. The Chevauchée was a highly organized, meticulously planned operation that required exceptional coordination and leadership. The English had perfected this form of warfare during their campaigns in Scotland, and by the 1352nd, it had become their signature strategy against the French. The region the Black Prince chose to target was no accident. This was one of the richest areas of France, a major contributor to King John's treasury and the economic heart of his southern domains. By striking here, Edward would not only fill his own coffers with plunder but would simultaneously drain the French king's resources, making it nearly impossible for John to field an effective army in response. On August 4th, 1356, the Black Prince led his force of 6,000 Anglo-Gascon soldiers north from Bergerac toward the wealthy city of Bourges. This army was a carefully balanced instrument of war, combining English and Gascon knights with devastating longbowmen and disciplined men-at-arms. They moved with the speed and precision of a well-oiled machine, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake that could be seen for miles. The force was too small to besiege major cities, but that wasn't the point. Instead, they swept through the countryside like a scythe through wheat, pillaging and burning everything in their path. French towns that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. The wealth of generations disappeared into the baggage trains of English soldiers who could barely believe their good fortune. As news of the devastation spread, panic rippled across France like wildfire. Local militias scattered before they could even sight the English banners. French commanders found their forces melting away as soldiers fled to protect their own homes and families. The psychological warfare was working exactly as Edward had planned. But the Black Prince's strategy went far beyond mere destruction. He was deliberately provoking King John into a response, forcing the French monarch into exactly the kind of pitched battle that English tactics were designed to win. By ravaging the heartland of France, Edward was issuing a challenge that no self-respecting king could ignore. John II faced an impossible choice. He could allow the English to continue their rampage unopposed, which would destroy what remained of his authority and bankrupt his kingdom. Or he could gather his forces and march out to face an enemy who had chosen the time, place, and manner of engagement. Either way, he was walking into a trap that had been months in the making. The French response was as predictable as it was disastrous. On May 14th, John issued an arriére-ban, a formal call to arms for every able-bodied male in the kingdom. The response was lukewarm at best. The call was repeated in late May, then again in early June, each time with decreasing enthusiasm from nobles who had their own problems to worry about. Even worse, the French treasury was so depleted that they couldn't pay wages to the men who did answer the call. The army that slowly assembled was a patchwork of thousands of tiny contingents, each unfamiliar with the others, led by commanders who had never worked together and equipped with whatever weapons and armor their lords could scrape together. By mid-September, King John had managed to gather a force estimated between 11,000 and 14,000 men. On paper, this army should have been more than capable of crushing the Black Prince's smaller force. The French had more knights, more men-at-arms, and the advantage of fighting on their own soil. What they didn't have was unity, experience, or a commander who understood that this would be unlike any battle they had ever fought. The French army that assembled near Poitiers was a magnificent sight to behold. But magnificence and military effectiveness were two very different things. Thousands of knights rode under glittering banners, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their weapons blessed by priests who assured them that God would grant victory to the righteous. The flower of French chivalry had gathered for what they believed would be a glorious triumph over the English upstarts. But beneath the pageantry lay fatal flaws that the Black Prince had spent years learning to exploit. This wasn't an army in any modern sense. It was a collection of feudal contingents, each loyal primarily to their own lord rather than to any unified command. Dukes, counts, and barons had brought their own retinues, their own tactics, and their own ideas about how the battle should be fought. Coordination was a luxury they couldn't afford, and cooperation was a concept many of them had never truly mastered. King John himself embodied the contradictions that would doom his force. He was a man caught between two worlds, the fading age of chivalric idealism and the harsh realities of evolving warfare. In his mind, this battle was about more than military strategy. It was about honor, about proving that French valor could triumph over English cunning, about showing his rebellious nobles that their king was still worthy of their loyalty. The medieval concept of chivalry that drove John's thinking was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. Chivalry demanded personal courage, face-to-face combat, and the pursuit of glory through individual feats of arms. These were admirable qualities in a knight, but they could be catastrophic in a king responsible for the lives of thousands of men and the fate of a kingdom. As the two armies maneuvered around Poitiers in the third week of September, the contrast in leadership became starkly apparent. While John focused on the grand gestures and noble rhetoric that would inspire his knights, the Black Prince was calculating angles, studying terrain, and positioning his forces with the cold precision of a chess master arranging pieces for checkmate. Edward's army was roughly half the size of the French force, but it was an instrument honed by years of successful campaigning. Every man knew his role, every unit understood how it fit into the larger tactical picture. The English longbowmen, in particular, were veterans who had proven their devastating effectiveness at Crécy a decade earlier. They carried bows that could drive arrows through plate armor at distances that French crossbowmen could only dream of reaching. The longbow itself was a weapon that embodied everything the English had learned about practical warfare. Standing 6 feet tall and requiring years of training to master, it could loose 15 arrows per minute in the hands of a skilled archer. More importantly, masses of longbowmen firing in coordinated volleys could turn the charge of heavy cavalry into a slaughter before the knights ever reached the English lines. The French had faced these weapons before, but they had learned all the wrong lessons. Instead of developing tactics to counter the longbow's advantages, they had convinced themselves that superior numbers and noble courage would somehow overcome English archery. It was a delusion that would cost them everything. On September 18th, as both armies settled into their positions, a papal envoy made one final attempt at negotiation. The terms offered by the Black Prince seemed almost insultingly generous. He would return all the plunder his army had taken, release all French prisoners without ransom, and swear not to take up arms against France for 7 years. In exchange, he asked only for safe passage back to English-held Gascony. For any rational commander, these terms should have been irresistible. The Black Prince was offering to walk away from France with nothing to show for his campaign, except the devastation he had already inflicted. King John would have achieved a bloodless victory, and could have claimed that his mere presence had forced the English to retreat. But rationality had no place in John's thinking. The offer was seen not as a reasonable solution, but as proof of English weakness. Here was the son of Edward III, trapped far from home with a tiny army, begging for permission to escape. To accept such terms would be to admit that France could not protect its own territory from a handful of English raiders. John's rejection of the peace terms sealed the fate of his army. He demanded nothing less than the Black Prince's complete surrender as a hostage, terms so humiliating that no English commander could possibly accept them. The die was cast, and both sides began preparing for a battle that would determine not just the immediate outcome of the campaign, but the balance of power between England and France for generations to come. As dawn broke on September 19th, 1356, the Black Prince surveyed the battlefield he had chosen with the eye of a master tactician. His position was a textbook example of defensive warfare, utilizing every natural advantage the terrain offered. The English army was deployed on a plateau above a wooded slope, protected on the left flank by marshes and streams, and on the right by rough ground broken by hedges and vineyards. Most crucially, the only practical approach to the English position was through a narrow gap in a thick hedge, barely wide enough for 4 knights to ride abreast. This choke point would force the French to attack in small groups, rather than using their numerical advantage, neutralizing one of their greatest assets before the battle even began. The Black Prince divided his forces into 3 battles, all fighting on foot to present a more stable defensive line. His archers were positioned to command the approaches, their arrows able to sweep the killing ground in front of the hedge with devastating effect. Behind them, dismounted knights and men-at-arms waited with poleaxes, swords and other close combat weapons to finish any Frenchman who survived the arrow storm. But Edward's masterstroke was invisible to French eyes. Hidden behind the hill, he had positioned a reserve force of mounted knights under the command of Jean de Grailly, the Captal de Buch. This mobile reserve would remain out of sight until the critical moment when they would strike the French army in the flank and rear, turning an organized assault into a rout. The French, meanwhile, had arranged their forces in the traditional manner that had served them well in previous centuries. 3 great battles of knights and men-at-arms would advance in sequence, each one intended to overwhelm the English through sheer weight of numbers and the irresistible momentum of heavy cavalry. What they failed to understand was that the Black Prince had studied every aspect of their tactical doctrine and had specifically designed his battle plan to turn French strengths into weaknesses. The narrow approach would negate their numbers. The English archery would devastate their cavalry, and when the moment was right, the hidden reserve would deliver the killing blow that would transform military defeat into political catastrophe. As the morning mist lifted from the fields outside Poitiers, King John made his final fatal decision, despite advice from seasoned commanders who urged him to surround and starve the trapped English. Despite the obvious advantages of siege warfare against an enemy far from home, John chose the path of glory over the path of victory. In an age where chivalric honor mattered more than strategic sense, the prospect of a decisive battle was politically irresistible to a monarch whose authority was crumbling. The French attack began at dawn with a forlorn hope of 300 German knights under the command of 2 marshals of France, Barons Clermont and Audrihem. These were elite warriors, the cream of continental chivalry, riding the finest war horses gold could buy. Their mission was simple in concept but suicidal in execution: charge down the narrow road, smash through the English lines, and open the way for the main assault. The thunder of hooves echoed across the valley as the German knights spurred their mounts to a gallop. Lances leveled, banners streaming. They rode toward immortality with the confidence of men who had never faced the coordinated fury of English longbowmen. The sight was magnificent, a scene from the pages of chivalric romance brought to life in steel and silk. But romance had no place on this battlefield. As the knights closed to within 200 yards of the English position, the air filled with the whistle of arrows. Thousands of bodkin points, each one capable of punching through the finest armor, descended like deadly rain upon the charging cavalry. Horses screamed and stumbled, their riders pitched from their saddles to be trampled under the hooves of their own comrades. Those few knights who survived the arrow storm and reached the gap in the hedge found themselves trapped in a killing ground, barely wide enough for 4 men. English men-at-arms waited with poleaxes and war hammers, weapons specifically designed to crush armor and break bones. The flower of German chivalry was cut down in minutes, their bodies piling up in the narrow passage like cordwood. Marshal Clermont himself fell in the melee, his skull split by an English poleaxe. Baron Audrihem, wounded and unhorsed, was dragged away as a prisoner, his ransom already being calculated by his captors. The forlorn hope had become exactly what its name implied, a sacrifice to French pride that achieved nothing except to demonstrate the futility of charging English positions. The destruction of the vanguard sent shockwaves through the French ranks, but King John pressed forward with his plan. The second battle, led by the Dauphin himself, advanced up the slope toward the English position. These were not foreign mercenaries, but French nobles fighting for their homeland, and they marched with grim determination despite the carnage they had just witnessed. The Dauphin's men faced the same deadly gauntlet that had destroyed the German knights. English archers, their quivers still full after the brief opening engagement, drew their bowstrings and let fly volley after volley into the advancing French. The slope became littered with bodies as knights and men-at-arms fell by the dozens, their advance slowing under the weight of casualties. But French valor was not easily broken. The survivors pressed forward, step by bloody step, until they reached the English lines and the real fighting began. This was combat at its most brutal, poleaxe against sword, warhammer against mail, where a man's life depended on his strength, skill, and the quality of his armor. The clash of steel rang across the battlefield as the two forces locked in desperate hand-to-hand combat. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the French might break through. The Dauphin's men fought with the fury of cornered wolves, their weapons rising and falling in deadly rhythm. The English line bent under the pressure, individual soldiers falling back step by step as French steel found gaps in their defenses. It was at this critical juncture that the Black Prince demonstrated the tactical genius that would make him a legend. Seeing his line under intense pressure, Edward committed his reserves at exactly the right moment. Fresh English troops poured into the melee, their arrival tipping the balance back in favor of the defenders. The French assault wavered, then broke. The Dauphin's battle, bloodied and exhausted, fell back down the slope, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead among the English positions. The second wave had achieved more than the first, but it too had been repulsed with heavy losses. As the French regrouped for their next assault, English archers moved among the bodies scattered across the battlefield, pulling arrows from corpses to replenish their supplies. This grisly harvest was a practical necessity, but it also served as a psychological weapon, demonstrating to the watching French that the English were prepared for a long fight. The third French battle, led by the young Duke of Orleans, should have been the hammer blow that finally shattered English resistance. These were veteran troops, many of them survivors of previous campaigns, who understood exactly what they were facing. But understanding and overcoming were two very different things. As Orleans's men prepared to advance, they could see the slope ahead littered with the bodies of their countrymen. They could see the English archers standing ready behind their hedge, arrows nocked and bowstrings drawn. They could see the grim faces of English men-at-arms, their weapons already bloodied from the previous assaults. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments in French military history. Instead of advancing to support their king, the Duke of Orleans and his entire battle simply turned and fled the field. Whether this was cowardice, treachery, or a rational assessment of hopeless odds has been debated by historians for centuries, but the immediate impact was catastrophic for French morale. Suddenly, King John found himself facing the English with only his personal household and the remnants of the earlier attacks. Instead of commanding 14,000 men, he was down to perhaps 4,000 effective troops. The odds, already daunting, had become virtually impossible. But John II of France was not a man to abandon his duty, no matter how hopeless the situation. With his youngest son, Philip, at his side, the king led his final battle up the bloody slope toward the waiting English. These were the elite of French chivalry, knights who had sworn personal oaths of loyalty to their sovereign and who would die before they saw him dishonored. The English, exhausted from hours of fighting, nevertheless stood firm as the French king approached their lines. This was the moment the Black Prince had been waiting for, the culmination of months of planning and preparation. As John's forces became fully committed to the assault, Edward gave the signal for his hidden reserve to strike. Jean de Grailly and his mounted knights had waited patiently behind the hill, out of sight of French scouts, their horses stamping impatiently as the sounds of battle raged nearby. Now, at last, their moment had come. Spurring their mounts to a gallop, they swept around the English flank and struck the French army in the rear, hitting them at the exact moment when they were most vulnerable. The impact was devastating. French knights, focused on the enemy in front of them, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind by fresh English cavalry. Their formations, already strained by the uphill assault, disintegrated under the shock of this unexpected assault. What had been an organized attack became a confused melee as French soldiers found themselves surrounded and fighting for their lives. King John himself fought with desperate valor, wielding a massive battle-axe with the skill of a seasoned warrior. But even royal courage could not overcome tactical disaster. One by one, his bodyguards fell around him, cut down by English knights who pressed ever closer to their ultimate prize. The moment that would define the battle, and indeed the war itself, came when Denis de Morbecque, a French exile fighting for the English, approached the surrounded king. The words he spoke would echo through history. "Sire, I am a knight of Artois. Yield yourself to me and I will lead you to the Prince of Wales." The moment King John surrendered his royal glove, the medieval world shifted forever. The Black Prince had achieved the impossible, capturing an anointed monarch through tactical brilliance rather than mere fortune. France would pay millions in ransom, lose vast territories, and descend into chaos that lasted decades. Sometimes genius isn't about having the biggest army, but knowing exactly how to use the one you have.